Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished feeding the last of the horses in the stable. The autumn sun was setting behind the rolling hills of Montana, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She had been working at the Whitman Ranch for 3 years now, and despite the hard work, she loved every moment of it. The smell of hay, the sound of horses neighing, and the vast open spaces made her feel more at home than she had ever felt anywhere else. At 25, Sarah was one of the few women working as a ranch hand in the area. Most folks thought it was strange for a woman to be doing such heavy work, but Mr. Whitman had given her a chance when she desperately needed it. She had arrived in town with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to start fresh. The ranch became her sanctuary, and the animals became her friends. As she walked toward the main house to grab her dinner, Sarah noticed a figure sitting by the old oak tree near the property line. The person was hunched over, clearly exhausted. Sarah squinted in the fading light and realized it was a Native American man, probably in his 30s. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Sarah's heart went out to him immediately. She had heard stories about the struggles of the local native tribes, how they had been pushed off their ancestral lands and forced to live on reservations with barely enough food to survive. Many had to travel long distances just to find work or trade for basic necessities. Without hesitation, Sarah changed direction and headed toward the kitchen. She knew Mrs. Whitman had made extra stew for dinner, and there was fresh bread cooling on the counter. She quickly filled a large bowl with the hearty beef stew and grabbed 2 thick slices of bread, wrapping them in a clean cloth. The kitchen was warm and inviting, filled with the aroma of herbs and cooked meat. Sarah also filled a mason jar with fresh water from the well. She knew she was taking a risk by giving away the ranch's food without permission, but she couldn't bear to see someone go hungry when there was plenty to share. Quietly, Sarah made her way back outside. The man was still sitting under the tree, his head resting against the rough bark. As she approached, he looked up with weary eyes that held both caution and hope. "Sir," Sarah said softly, not wanting to startle him, "I brought you some food. You look like you could use a good meal." The man's eyes widened in surprise. He studied Sarah's face carefully, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. In his experience, white folks rarely showed such kindness to his people. "You sure about this?" he asked in English, though his accent revealed that it wasn't his first language. "Of course," Sarah replied, setting the bowl and bread down on a flat rock nearby. "Everyone deserves to eat when they're hungry." The man slowly reached for the food, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion. As he began to eat, Sarah could see the relief wash over his face. He ate slowly at first, then more eagerly as his hunger took over. "My name is Sarah," she said, sitting down on the ground a respectful distance away. "Joseph," he replied between bites. "Joseph Running Bear." They sat in comfortable silence as Joseph finished his meal. Sarah could see that he was feeling stronger already, the color returning to his face. When he was done, he looked at her with genuine gratitude. "Why did you help me?" Joseph asked. "Your people and my people, we don't usually—" He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "My grandmother always told me that we're all just people trying to make our way in this world. Color of skin or where we come from doesn't change the fact that we all get hungry. We all feel pain and we all deserve kindness." Joseph nodded slowly, clearly moved by her words. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Sarah said with a sad smile. "She passed away last year, but I try to live by what she taught me." As they talked, Sarah learned that Joseph had been traveling for days, trying to find work to support his family back on the reservation. His wife was expecting their second child, and they desperately needed money for food and medicine. The journey had been harder than expected, and he had run out of supplies 2 days ago. "The reservation is still 50 miles north," Joseph explained. "I was hoping to find work at one of the ranches, but most won't hire my people." Sarah's heart ached for him. She knew the prejudice that existed in the area, the fear and mistrust that had built up over years of conflict and misunderstanding. But she also knew that Joseph was just a man trying to provide for his family, no different from any of the ranch hands she worked alongside. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah realized she needed to get back to the bunkhouse. The other workers would be wondering where she was, and she had an early morning ahead of her. "I should go," she said, standing and brushing the dirt off her pants. But Joseph, if you need a place to rest tonight, there's an old barn about a quarter-mile down the road. Mr. Johnson doesn't use it anymore, and it's got clean hay and shelter from the wind. Joseph stood as well, looking stronger than he had when she first found him. Thank you, Sarah. I won't forget this kindness. As Sarah walked back toward the ranch buildings, she felt a warm glow in her chest. Helping Joseph had felt like the most natural thing in the world, and she was glad she had followed her instincts. She had no way of knowing that her simple act of compassion would soon change her life in ways she could never imagine. The next morning came early, as it always did on the ranch. Sarah was up before dawn, ready to start her daily routine of feeding the animals and mucking out the stalls. She wondered briefly if Joseph had found the barn she mentioned, and if he was feeling better after a good night's rest. As she made her way to the horse stable, Sarah noticed Mr. Whitman standing near the main house with his foreman, Jake Miller. They were both looking in her direction, and their expressions were serious. Sarah's stomach tightened with worry, but she continued with her work, hoping whatever they were discussing had nothing to do with her. Little did she know that someone had seen her giving food to Joseph the night before, and word had already reached Mr. Whitman's ears. The wheels were already in motion for a confrontation that would test everything Sarah believed about right and wrong. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Sarah heard heavy footsteps approaching the stable. She was brushing down Thunder, Mr. Whitman's prize stallion, when the barn door swung open with more force than necessary. Jake Miller stood in the doorway, his weathered face set in a hard expression that made Sarah's stomach drop. "Boss wants to see you," Jake said curtly, not meeting her eyes. "Right now." Sarah set down the brush and followed Jake toward the main house, her mind racing. In 3 years of working at the ranch, Mr. Whitman had never summoned her to the house for anything other than her monthly pay. The formal way Jake was acting told her this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Mr. Whitman was waiting on the front porch, his arms crossed over his broad chest. At 60 years old, he was still an imposing man, tall and solid from years of ranch work. His gray hair was neatly combed and his blue eyes were cold as winter steel. Beside him stood Mrs. Whitman, looking uncomfortable and avoiding Sarah's gaze. "Sarah," Mr. Whitman began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "I'm told you gave food to an Indian last night." "Food from my kitchen." Sarah's heart began to pound, but she lifted her chin and met his stare directly. "Yes, sir, I did. There was a hungry man sitting by the oak tree, and I couldn't just leave him there to starve." "That man was a thief and a vagrant," Mr. Whitman said, his voice rising slightly. "Tommy Henderson saw you giving him food, and he also saw that same Indian trying to steal chickens from the Murphy place earlier in the day." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "Sir, I don't believe that's true." Joseph seemed like an honest man who was just trying to find work to feed his family. "Joseph?" Mr. Whitman's eyebrows shot up. "You're on a first-name basis with him now?" "Sarah, I thought you had better sense than this. These people can't be trusted. They'll take whatever you give them and then come back for more, bringing their friends with them." "Mr. Whitman, with respect, I don't think that's fair," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. "Joseph was hungry and tired. I gave him 1 bowl of stew and some bread. It was just common decency." Jake Miller stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Common decency? Sarah, these Indians have been raiding ranches and stealing cattle for months. Just last week, the Johnson place lost 6 head of cattle to a group of them, and you're out here feeding them like they're guests at a church social." Mrs. Whitman finally spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Sarah, dear, I understand you meant well, but you can't just give away our food to strangers, especially not to Indians. It sends the wrong message to the rest of the workers and to the community." Sarah felt a flash of anger at the unfairness of it all. "Mrs. Whitman, you've always taught your children to be charitable and kind. How is this different? If a white man had been sitting under that tree, hungry and tired, wouldn't you have expected someone to help him? That's completely different, and you know it," Mr. Whitman snapped. "White men don't go around stealing and causing trouble like these savages do." The word savages hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about Joseph's gentle manner, the way he had thanked her so genuinely, the story he had told about his pregnant wife. There had been nothing savage about him at all. "I won't apologize for showing kindness to someone in need," Sarah said quietly. "And I won't stand here and listen to you call people savages just because they're different from us." The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Mr. Whitman's face turned red with anger, and Jake Miller actually took a step back, clearly shocked by Sarah's defiance. "You won't apologize?" Mr. Whitman repeated slowly. "Young lady, you work for me. You live on my property, you eat my food, and you follow my rules. One of those rules is that we don't consort with Indians, and we certainly don't encourage them to come around here by feeding them." Sarah's hands were shaking now, but she kept her voice level. "Then I guess we have a problem, Mr. Whitman, because I can't promise I won't help someone who's hungry." "Regardless of who they are," Mrs. Whitman gasped softly, and Jake Miller whistled low under his breath. No one talked back to Mr. Whitman, especially not a hired hand who depended on him for everything. "Is that your final word on this matter?" Mr. Whitman asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Sarah thought about backing down, about apologizing and promising never to do it again. She thought about her little room in the bunkhouse, her steady pay and the security the ranch provided. But then she thought about her grandmother's words about treating all people with dignity, and she thought about Joseph's grateful eyes. "Yes, sir, it is." Mr. Whitman nodded slowly as if he had expected this answer. "Then you're fired, Sarah. I want you off my property by sundown. Jake will escort you to the bunkhouse to collect your things." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. 3 years of hard work. 3 years of proving herself gone in an instant because she had chosen compassion over prejudice. "I understand," Sarah said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "I'll gather my belongings and be gone within the hour." As she turned to leave with Jake, Mrs. Whitman called out to her, "Sarah, wait. You don't have to do this. Just apologize to my husband, promise it won't happen again, and we can forget this whole incident." Sarah turned back, seeing the genuine concern in the older woman's eyes. For a moment she wavered. It would be so easy to take back her words, to swallow her pride and keep her job. But then she remembered Joseph's story about his pregnant wife, about his long journey to find work, about the desperation in his eyes. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Whitman, but I can't apologize for doing what I believe is right." Back at the bunkhouse, Sarah's few possessions fit easily into her old carpet bag. 3 years of life on the ranch, and she could carry everything she owned in one small bag. The other ranch hands watched silently as she packed, some looking sympathetic, others clearly thinking she had lost her mind. "You really threw away a good job for some Indian you don't even know?" asked Pete, one of the older cowboys. Sarah folded her extra shirt carefully before answering. "I didn't throw away anything, Pete. I chose to stand up for what I believe in. Sometimes that's more important than a job." "Well, I hope your principles keep you warm at night," Pete muttered, but there was no real malice in his voice. As Sarah walked away from the ranch that had been her home for 3 years, she carried her bag in one hand and her grandmother's Bible in the other. She had no idea where she would go or how she would survive, but she had her integrity intact, and somehow that felt more valuable than anything else she could have taken with her. The sun was setting as Sarah reached the main road, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. She paused for a moment to look back at the ranch, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. She had made her choice, and despite the uncertainty ahead, she knew in her heart that it had been the right one. Sarah's small cottage sat at the edge of town, a modest wooden structure that she had inherited from her grandmother along with a few acres of land. She had been renting it out to earn extra money while living at the ranch, but now it would become her refuge. The tenant, a traveling merchant, had moved on just 2 weeks ago, leaving the place empty but clean. As she unpacked her few belongings, Sarah tried not to think about how quickly her life had changed. Yesterday morning she had been a respected ranch hand with steady work and a secure future. Now she was unemployed in a town where news traveled fast, and everyone would soon know why she had been fired from the Whitman ranch. The cottage was simple but comfortable, with a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom that looked out over the vegetable garden her grandmother had planted years ago. The garden was overgrown now, but Sarah could see that some of the hardier plants had survived on their own. Tomatoes hung heavy on the vine, and she could make out potato plants and herbs scattered throughout the weeds. That first night, Sarah sat by the fireplace with her grandmother's journal, reading the familiar words by candlelight. Her grandmother had written about the early days in Montana, about the struggles of building a life in the wilderness, and about the importance of treating all people with respect and kindness. "God puts people in our path for a reason," one entry read. Sometimes we're meant to help them and sometimes they're meant to help us. The trick is being open to both possibilities. Sarah wondered if helping Joseph had been one of those moments her grandmother wrote about. She still believed she had done the right thing, but the consequences were weighing heavily on her mind. She had enough money saved to last a few weeks, but after that, she would need to find work. In a town where most jobs were connected to ranching and where word of her firing was already spreading, that might prove difficult. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Sarah was working in the garden, pulling weeds and trying to salvage what she could from the neglected plants when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see Dr. Matthews and his wife Eleanor riding up the path to her cottage. Dr. Matthews was a kind man in his 50s who served the medical needs of the entire county. He had been a friend of Sarah's grandmother and had delivered Sarah herself 25 years ago. Eleanor Matthews was a school teacher and one of the few educated women in the area who supported other women's independence. "Sarah, my dear," Eleanor called out as they dismounted. "We heard what happened at the Whitman place. We wanted to make sure you were all right." Sarah brushed the dirt from her hands and walked over to greet them. "I'm fine, Mrs. Matthews. Thank you for coming to check on me." Dr. Matthews studied her face with the careful eye of someone used to reading people's health and emotions. "You look tired, Sarah. This can't have been easy for you." "It hasn't been," Sarah admitted. "But I don't regret what I did. I just wish people could see past their prejudices to the humanity in others." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Your grandmother would be proud of you for standing up for your principles. She always said you had a strong moral compass." "A strong moral compass doesn't pay the bills," Sarah said with a rueful smile. "I need to find work, but I'm not sure who's going to hire me after this." Dr. Matthews and Eleanor exchanged glances before Eleanor spoke up. "Actually, that's part of why we're here. I've been needing help with the school, especially with the younger children. The town has grown and I have more students than I can handle alone. Would you be interested in helping me teach?" Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "But I don't have any formal education in teaching." "You can read and write better than most people in this town," Eleanor replied. "And more importantly, you have patience and compassion. Those are the most important qualities in a teacher. I could pay you enough to live on and it would give you time to figure out what you want to do next." "I don't know what to say," Sarah began, feeling overwhelmed by their kindness. "Say yes," Dr. Matthews urged. "The town needs more people like you, Sarah. People who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." That afternoon, Sarah found herself walking through the town's main street for the first time since leaving the ranch. She had errands to run and wanted to get a sense of how the community was reacting to the news of her firing. The reactions were mixed as she had expected. At the general store, Mrs. Peterson was friendly enough but seemed nervous, glancing around to see who might be watching their interaction. "I heard about your trouble at the ranch," she said quietly. "I think you meant well, dear, but you know how people feel about Indians around here." At the bank, however, Mr. Morrison was more direct in his disapproval. "Sarah, your grandmother was a fine woman, but I think she filled your head with too many ideas about treating everyone the same. There's a natural order to things, and it's best not to upset it." But there were also surprising supporters. Old Tom Bradley, a retired miner who spent most of his time at the saloon, stopped her on the street to shake her hand. "Good for you, girl," he said gruffly. "I've known some good Indians in my time. Most folks around here are too scared to admit it, but they're just people like the rest of us." As Sarah walked home that evening, she reflected on the day's conversations. The town was divided as she had expected, but there were more people willing to support her than she had thought. Maybe Eleanor was right when she said the town needed more people willing to stand up for what was right. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she heard a soft sound outside her cottage. It was barely audible, like someone trying to move quietly through the grass. She went to the window and peered out into the darkness but saw nothing unusual. The sound came again, and this time she was sure someone was out there. Sarah lit a lantern and stepped onto her small front porch. "Who's there?" she called out softly. A figure emerged from the shadows near the old oak tree at the edge of her property. It was Joseph, but he looked different somehow, more alert, more cautious. Behind him, Sarah could make out the shapes of other men, though they stayed hidden in the darkness. "Sarah," Joseph said quietly, stepping closer to the porch, "I heard what happened to you because of helping me. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize, Sarah replied, keeping her voice low. I made my own choice. Joseph studied her face in the lantern light. You lost your job because you showed kindness to a stranger. That means something to my people. Sarah noticed that Joseph seemed different tonight, less desperate, more confident. His clothes were cleaner and he carried himself like a man who had found his purpose. I wanted to tell you, Joseph continued, that your kindness will not be forgotten. If you ever need help, if anyone threatens you because of what you did for me, you call my name to the wind and help will come. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Joseph melted back into the shadows, and the shapes of the other men disappeared with him. Sarah stood on her porch for several minutes, listening to the night sounds and wondering if the encounter had really happened or if her tired mind was playing tricks on her. As she finally went back inside and blew out the lantern, Sarah had no way of knowing that Joseph Running Bear was not just a desperate man looking for work. He was the son of a chief, a respected warrior who had been scouting the white settlements to assess the threat they posed to his people. Her simple act of kindness had shown him that not all white people were enemies, and word of her sacrifice was already spreading through the tribal camps hidden in the mountains above town. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah started helping Eleanor Matthews at the schoolhouse, and she was beginning to find her rhythm in this new life. The children were eager to learn, and Sarah discovered she had a natural talent for explaining difficult concepts in simple ways. The work was rewarding, though the pay was modest, and she was starting to feel hopeful about her future. The town's reaction to her presence continued to be mixed. Some families welcomed her warmly, appreciating the extra attention their children received. Others remained cool and distant, clearly disapproving of her past actions. Sarah tried not to let the negativity affect her, focusing instead on the students who looked forward to her lessons each day. It was a crisp October morning when the first signs of trouble appeared. Sarah was walking to the schoolhouse when she noticed Jake Miller and 2 other men from the Whitman Ranch standing outside Peterson's general store. They were talking in low voices, but their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw her approaching. Morning, Sarah, Jake said, his tone neutral but his eyes cold. Heard you're playing teacher now. Good morning, Jake, Sarah replied politely, not wanting to create a scene on the main street. I hope you and the boys are doing well. We're doing just fine, said Tom Bradley, one of the younger ranch hands. Better than some folks anyway. Word is the Indians have been getting bolder lately. A lot of people think feeding them just encourages them to stick around and cause trouble. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with anger, but she kept her voice steady. I think you'll find that kindness tends to breed kindness, not trouble. Jake stepped closer, lowering his voice so passers-by couldn't hear. Sarah, you might want to be more careful about who you defend. There have been reports of Indian scouts in the hills above town. People are getting nervous and they remember who's been friendly with their kind. Their kind? Sarah repeated, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. They're human beings, Jake, not wild animals. Tell that to the Murphy family, Tom interjected. They lost another 12 chickens last night, and this time they found moccasin prints in the mud. Your friend Joseph and his people are stealing from hard-working families. Sarah wanted to argue, to defend Joseph and explain that one man's actions didn't represent an entire people. But she could see a small crowd beginning to gather. The last thing she wanted was to create more controversy that might affect her position at the school. I need to get to the schoolhouse, she said simply. The children are waiting. As she walked away, Sarah could hear the men continuing their conversation behind her, their voices carrying just loud enough for her to catch fragments about Indian lovers and teaching the wrong lessons. She quickened her pace, eager to reach the safety of the school and the innocent faces of her students. The school day passed normally, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was building in the town. During the lunch break, she noticed several groups of men gathering outside various businesses, their conversations animated and their gestures sharp. By afternoon, the tension in the air was almost palpable. Eleanor Matthews arrived earlier than usual to help with the afternoon lessons, and Sarah could see the worry etched on her face. Sarah, I think you should stay at our house tonight, Eleanor said quietly while the children worked on their arithmetic. There's a meeting at the town hall this evening, and I'm afraid it's not going to be friendly. What kind of meeting? Sarah asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Several ranchers have called for a community discussion about the Indian problem, Eleanor explained. They're claiming that being too soft on the local tribes is encouraging raids and theft. Your name has been mentioned more than once as an example of misguided sympathy. Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety. Eleanor, I can't hide every time people disagree with me. If I've done something wrong, I need to face the consequences. You haven't done anything wrong, Eleanor said firmly, but that doesn't mean people won't try to make you pay for it anyway. Please at least consider staying away from your cottage tonight. That evening, against Eleanor's advice, Sarah returned to her grandmother's cottage. She refused to be driven from her own home by fear and prejudice. As she prepared a simple dinner, she could see the glow of torches gathering at the town hall in the distance. The meeting had begun, and she could only imagine what was being said about her and about the local native tribes. Around 9 o'clock, Sarah heard the sound of horses approaching her cottage. Through the window she could see at least a dozen men on horseback, their faces lit by torchlight. Her heart began to race as she recognized several of them. Jake Miller, Tom Bradley, and even Mr. Whitman himself were among the group. The men stopped in front of her cottage, and Mr. Whitman dismounted, walking to her front door. His knock was loud and authoritative, designed to intimidate rather than request entry. "Sarah," he called out, "open this door. We need to have a talk." Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. She stood in the doorway, blocking their view of the interior, and met Mr. Whitman's gaze directly. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "You can pack up your things and leave town," Mr. Whitman said bluntly. "Tonight, we've had enough of your Indian-loving ways, and we're not going to stand by while you encourage them to raid our property. I haven't encouraged anyone to do anything except show basic human decency," Sarah replied. "And I'm not leaving my home because you're afraid of people you don't understand." Jake Miller spurred his horse closer to the porch. "Sarah, you're not listening. The Indians stole 20 head of cattle from the Morrison place today. They left a message carved into a fence post, saying this was just the beginning. People are scared and they're angry." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If cattle were being stolen and messages were being left, the situation was escalating far beyond anything she had imagined. But she still couldn't believe that Joseph was involved in such activities. "Even if that's true," she said carefully, "it has nothing to do with me. I gave one man a bowl of stew. I didn't organize a cattle raid." "You opened the door," Tom Bradley shouted from the back of the group. "You showed them that some white folks are weak and can be manipulated. Now they think they can take whatever they want." The accusation stung because Sarah could see how some people might view her actions that way, but she refused to accept that showing compassion was a sign of weakness. "I won't apologize for treating another human being with kindness," she said firmly, "and I won't be bullied into leaving my home." Mr. Whitman's face darkened with anger. "Sarah, you're making this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to give you a chance to leave with your dignity intact, but if you insist on staying, we can't guarantee your safety." The threat was clear, though not explicitly stated. Sarah felt fear creeping up her spine, but she also felt the strength her grandmother had always shown in the face of adversity. "Is that a threat, Mr. Whitman?" she asked loudly, making sure all the men could hear her. "Are you threatening a woman on her own property because she showed kindness to someone in need?" Several of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Even in a time and place where might often made right, threatening a lone woman didn't sit well with everyone. "It's not a threat," Mr. Whitman said finally. "It's a warning. There are forces at work here that are bigger than your personal feelings about right and wrong. People are scared, and scared people do unpredictable things." As the men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Sarah standing alone on her porch, she realized that her simple act of kindness had set events in motion that were now spiraling beyond anyone's control. The night was quiet again, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before a much larger storm. Sarah barely slept that night. Every sound outside her cottage made her heart race, from the wind rustling through the oak tree to the distant howl of coyotes in the hills. She kept her grandmother's old rifle loaded and within reach, though she prayed she would never need to use it. When dawn finally broke over the mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Sarah felt exhausted but relieved to have made it through the night. She was preparing her morning coffee when she heard the sound of running footsteps on the path to her cottage. Through the window, she saw young Timothy Peterson, the general store owner's 10-year-old son, racing toward her door. His face was flushed with excitement and fear as he pounded on her door. Miss Sarah, he called out breathlessly. Ma sent me to warn you. There's Indians coming down from the hills, lots of them. Pa says they're painted for war. Sarah's blood went cold. She opened the door and knelt down to Timothy's level, trying to keep her voice calm despite the panic rising in her chest. Slow down, Timothy. Tell me exactly what your father saw. Pa was up early checking the stock behind the store. Timothy gasped, still trying to catch his breath. He saw them coming down the mountain trail in single file. He counted at least 30 warriors, all painted up and carrying weapons. They're heading straight for town. Sarah's mind raced. If a war party was indeed approaching the settlement, everyone was in terrible danger. The town had no real defenses and only a handful of men with military experience. Most of the ranchers and townspeople had rifles, but they were no match for experienced warriors fighting on their home territory. Timothy, I want you to run straight home to your parents, Sarah said firmly. Tell them to gather everyone they can and head to the church. It's the strongest building in town. Can you do that for me? The boy nodded eagerly, proud to have such an important mission. As he ran back toward town, Sarah quickly gathered a few essential items, her rifle, ammunition, some food, and her grandmother's Bible. If this was to be her last day, she wanted to face it with the things that mattered most to her. But as she stepped outside her cottage, Sarah was struck by an odd thought. If the war party was intent on attacking the settlement, why had Timothy been able to approach her cottage safely? Her property sat on the path between the mountains and the town. Surely the warriors would have already passed by her home. Walking to the edge of her property, Sarah looked up toward the mountain trail. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then as her eyes adjusted to the morning light, she began to make out figures moving among the trees. They weren't advancing toward town as Timothy had reported. Instead, they seemed to be positioning themselves along the ridgeline, as if they were waiting for something. As Sarah studied the distant figures more carefully, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. One of the warriors had separated from the group and was making his way down the mountain toward her cottage. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about the way he moved. As the figure drew closer, Sarah's suspicions were confirmed. It was Joseph Running Bear, but he looked completely different from the desperate, hungry man she had helped weeks ago. His face was painted with red and black stripes. His hair was adorned with eagle feathers, and he carried a rifle as well as traditional weapons. This was not a man seeking work to feed his family. This was a warrior. Joseph approached her property line and stopped, raising his hand in greeting. Despite her fear, Sarah felt compelled to walk out to meet him. As she drew closer, she could see the intelligence and determination in his eyes, as well as something else that surprised her. Respect. Sarah, Joseph said quietly, speaking in English as he had before. I told you that your kindness would not be forgotten. I have come to keep my word. Joseph, what's happening? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Timothy Peterson said there were 30 warriors coming to attack the town. Joseph nodded gravely. The boy saw correctly. My people are preparing for war, but not against the town, not yet. We are here because of you. Sarah's confusion must have shown on her face because Joseph continued his explanation. After you lost your job for helping me, word spread among my people about the white woman who sacrificed everything to show kindness to a stranger. My father, Chief Running Bear, was impressed by your courage. He said you had the heart of a true warrior. I don't understand, Sarah said, though a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in her mind. Last night, a group of white men came to threaten you, Joseph continued. We were watching from the hills. We saw how you stood up to them, how you refused to be driven from your home despite their threats. My father decided that such courage should be protected. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of Joseph's words hit her. The cattle that were stolen, the message carved in the fence post. My father's way of drawing attention away from you, Joseph admitted. He knew that if the white men were focused on fighting us, they would leave you alone. He also wanted to test their courage, to see if they would stand and fight or run when faced with real danger. The sound of horses approaching at a gallop interrupted their conversation. Sarah turned to see a large group of riders racing toward her cottage from the direction of town. Even from a distance, she could recognize Mr. Whitman's tall figure leading the group. They were heavily armed and riding hard, clearly intent on confronting what they believed to be an Indian threat. Joseph, you have to go, Sarah said urgently. If they find you here, they'll kill you. Joseph smiled grimly. They will try, but I am not alone. He gestured toward the hillside where Sarah could now see dozens of warriors emerging from their concealed positions. They moved with practiced silence, taking up positions that would give them clear shots at anyone approaching the cottage. "This is madness," Sarah said, her voice rising with panic. "People are going to die because of a bowl of stew." "People are going to die because of hatred and fear," Joseph corrected her. "Your bowl of stew just showed us that not all white people share that hatred. It gave us hope that peace might be possible." The approaching riders were close enough now that Sarah could make out individual faces. Mr. Whitman was indeed leading the group, along with Jake Miller and at least 20 other armed men. They had clearly expected to find Sarah either dead or fled, because they pulled up short when they saw her standing calmly in front of her cottage. "Sarah," Mr. Whitman called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Get away from that Indian. We're here to rescue you." Sarah looked at Joseph, who was watching the approaching men with the calm alertness of a predator. Around them, she could sense the presence of the hidden warriors, their weapons trained on the group of townsmen. The slightest wrong move from either side would turn her peaceful property into a battlefield. "What happens now?" she asked Joseph quietly. "That depends on you," Joseph replied. "My father sent me to offer you a choice. You can come with us to our camp in the mountains where you will be safe and honored as a friend of our people, or you can stay here and face whatever these men have planned for you." Sarah looked back at the approaching riders, then at Joseph's painted face. Both choices seemed impossible. If she went with the warriors, she would be branded as a traitor and could never return to the white community. If she stayed, she might face the wrath of men who saw her as a dangerous influence that needed to be eliminated. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "There has to be a way to stop this before it gets out of hand." Joseph studied her face carefully. "You still believe that peace is possible between our peoples?" "I have to believe it," Sarah replied, "because the alternative is too terrible to accept." Joseph nodded slowly, coming to some internal decision. "Then we will see if your faith in the goodness of people is stronger than their fear and hatred. But know this, Sarah. Whatever choice you make, my people will remember your kindness. If you call for help, we will come." The riders were only 100 yards away now, close enough for Sarah to see the grim determination on their faces. In moments, she would have to choose between two worlds, neither of which seemed to offer her a safe haven. As she stood between the approaching townsmen and the hidden warriors, Sarah realized that her simple act of feeding a hungry stranger had placed her at the center of a conflict that could determine the future of everyone in the valley. Sarah made her decision in that moment, standing between two groups of armed men who saw each other as enemies. She would not choose a side in this conflict. Instead, she would try to build a bridge between them, even if it cost her everything. "Joseph," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the approaching riders, "tell your father that I'm honored by his protection, but I won't be the cause of bloodshed between our peoples. Ask him to keep his warriors hidden unless the white men attack first." Joseph frowned, clearly concerned for her safety. "Sarah, these men came here to harm you. My father will not allow that to happen, and I won't allow good people on either side to die because of me," Sarah replied firmly. "Please trust me to handle this my way." Joseph studied her face for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. He let out a low whistle that sounded like a bird call, and Sarah saw subtle movements among the trees as the hidden warriors acknowledged the signal. They would wait and watch, but they would not attack unless provoked. The townsmen reined in their horses about 50 feet from where Sarah stood. Mr. Whitman dismounted, his rifle held ready but not quite pointed at Joseph. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed to crackle like electricity before a storm. "Sarah, step away from that savage," Mr. Whitman commanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We know what he and his people have been doing. They've been stealing from us, threatening us, and now they've come to finish what they started." "Mr. Whitman," Sarah said calmly, taking a step forward so she was clearly positioned between the two groups. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. This man's name is Joseph Running Bear. He is not a savage, and he is not here to threaten anyone. He came to warn me that there might be trouble." Jake Miller spat into the dust. "Warn you? Sarah, there are at least 30 armed Indians hiding in those hills. They're painted for war, and they're here because you've been encouraging them to think they can take whatever they want from us." "That's not true," Sarah said, raising her voice so all the men could hear her clearly. "I gave one hungry man a meal. Nothing more, nothing less. If there are warriors in the hills, it's because you men came to my home last night and threatened me. They're here to protect me, not to attack you. A murmur ran through the group of townsmen. Several of them shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, clearly not having expected this explanation. Dr. Matthews, who Sarah now noticed was among the group, urged his horse forward. Sarah, is this true? Are you saying the Indians are here because of the threats made against you? Dr. Matthews, Sarah said, relief evident in her voice at seeing at least one friendly face among the crowd. Joseph tells me his people have been watching over me since I lost my job. They saw what happened here last night and they decided to intervene. Mr. Whitman's face turned red with anger. That's ridiculous. We were trying to protect the community from someone who's clearly lost her mind. And now you're claiming that your Indian friends are here to protect you from us? I'm saying that kindness breeds kindness and fear breeds fear, Sarah replied. When I helped Joseph, I planted a seed of friendship. When you threatened me, you planted a seed of conflict. Now we're all standing here armed and ready to fight, and for what? Because I gave a hungry man some food. Joseph, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. The woman speaks the truth. My father sent us here to watch over her because she showed honor to one of our people. We took cattle to draw your attention away from her, hoping you would focus your anger on us instead of on a woman who did nothing wrong. Tom Bradley, one of the younger ranch hands, couldn't contain himself any longer. Nothing wrong? She's been consorting with the enemy. She's a traitor to her own people. Whose enemy? Sarah asked sharply, turning to face Tom directly. Joseph's wife is expecting a baby. He was traveling for days, looking for honest work to feed his family. How does that make him my enemy? How does that make him anyone's enemy? Eleanor Matthews, who had apparently ridden out with the men despite the danger, urged her horse closer to the group. Sarah's right, she said firmly. We've let fear and prejudice turn us into something we're not. We're supposed to be civilized people, yet here we are, ready to start a war over a bowl of stew. Eleanor, stay out of this, Mr. Whitman warned. You don't understand the bigger picture here. I understand it perfectly, Eleanor shot back. A young woman showed compassion to a stranger, and instead of praising her for her Christian charity, we've driven her from her job and threatened her in her own home. What would Jesus have done in Sarah's situation? Would he have turned away a hungry man because of the color of his skin? The mention of Jesus had a visible impact on several of the men. Montana was a deeply religious territory, and Eleanor's words carried the weight of moral authority that even the angriest among them found difficult to dismiss. Joseph stepped forward slightly, his hands clearly visible and away from his weapons. I would like to speak to all of you, he said, his English clear and precise. My father is Chief Running Bear of the Northern Cheyenne. He sent me here not to start a war but to honor a debt. This woman, he gestured toward Sarah, lost everything because she treated me as a human being instead of an enemy. That kind of courage is rare among any people, white or Indian. We don't need lectures from Indians about courage, Jake Miller snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Joseph agreed, but perhaps you need reminders about honor. In my culture, when someone sacrifices for a stranger, that sacrifice must be repaid. Sarah gave me food when I was hungry, and kindness when I was despised. In return, my people will protect her from those who would harm her for showing that kindness. Dr. Matthews dismounted from his horse and walked closer to the group. Joseph, is it? What would it take for your people to leave this area peacefully? What would convince your father that Sarah is safe and doesn't need protection anymore? Joseph looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. My father would need to see that the white community accepts Sarah back as one of their own, that they honor her for her compassion instead of punishing her for it. And he would need assurance that no harm will come to those among your people who choose to treat Indians with dignity and respect. Mr. Whitman laughed bitterly. You're asking us to change everything about how we relate to your people based on one woman's misguided charity. No, Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the morning air. He's asking you to judge people by their actions instead of by their race. He's asking you to choose hope over fear and love over hatred. Is that really such an impossible thing to ask? The silence that followed was long and heavy. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out on the faces of the men around her. Some, like Dr. Matthews and Eleanor, clearly supported her position. Others, like Mr. Whitman and Jake Miller, remained skeptical and angry. But many seemed to be genuinely considering her words for the first time. Finally, Old Pete Bradley, one of the ranch hands who had worked with Sarah at the Whitman place, spoke up. Sarah always was a good worker and a decent person. Maybe we've been too quick to judge her for doing what any Christian ought to do. One by one, other voices began to join in, not all of them, and not with complete enthusiasm, but enough to create a shift in the atmosphere. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps this confrontation might end without bloodshed after all. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and orange, Sarah stood between two worlds and dared to believe that she might help them find a way to coexist in peace. The path forward would not be easy, and there would be many who resisted change on both sides. But for the first time since she had given Joseph that bowl of stew, Sarah felt that her choice had been vindicated. Sometimes one small act of kindness really could change the world.